Live service games are hard. This is the one thing that we've learned when looking at the games industry over the past decade, where we don't have to look far to find all of the corpses and shells of video games that are left in the dirt to slowly rot away. Destiny is the game that, against all of the odds, has managed to achieve continued success with no signs of slowing down. And this year, with the Lightfall DLC release, it managed to one-up itself yet again and break its previous all-time high concurrent player count. On Steam, that is. But I'm sure that this can be extrapolated to console numbers as well, especially given just how good Destiny feels to play on controller and how Destiny 1 started off as a console exclusive game. Whatever you may think of it, Destiny is the game that a lot of developers in the industry and a lot of publishers and studios, they're all looking at it, hoping to replicate some of its success and all of the revenue benefits that come with that. It is why PlayStation bought Bungie for almost $4 billion last year. That is how much this franchise is worth to them. But you've probably also read the headlines already about how Lightfall is a big disappointment now. The biggest one for Destiny in a long time. You've probably seen and read how it is a filler DLC and how Bungie is out of touch with what the player base really wants from their game. The story is very undercooked, the dialogue is cringe-inducing, and a lot of players feel that even a new destination isn't really all up to their expectations. And that is all coming off the back of what is probably the best DLC that Destiny has ever seen, which is The Witch Queen, released last year. So really, the question that a lot of players have now is, what happened? And why? And that is kind of the thing that I wanted to try to answer with this video, the why part. Because the one thing that I do know for sure is that the developers working on Destiny haven't suddenly lost their talent, or vision, or passion for this game, at least not collectively. What I believe this all comes down to is a lack of time. You might be a bit confused on how bad writing and cheesy dialogue could possibly have anything to do with a lack of time, but stay with me and we'll get there. Live service games are hard. And even though Bungie is on top of the food chain in this industry, that doesn't mean that they haven't been struggling to keep up. They might be too proud to show it or admit it, because admitting to that would be bad PR, but if you keep looking, you can see that they've been struggling to keep up with Destiny ever since the split up with Activision. Going independent definitely allowed them to do more things that they thought were more important for the franchise, but they must have also lost quite some resources with that. Shadowkeep was a campaign that more or less had you grind moon bounties 40% of the way through on a destination that was already in Destiny 1. Beyond Light was a bit better, but still light on content, and had to be delayed by a whole 2 months to even make that happen. Witch Queen had a really good campaign, but again that was delayed by another 3 months. It was pushed all the way into the next year. And now we have Lightfall, which they managed to deliver on time. But not only does it have more than a few things wrong with it, I actually believe that if it were completely up to Bungie, they would have liked to delay this DLC as well. There's even been a lot of theorizing and digging through the information online that has led to a fairly solid theory that the new subclass Strand was likely intended to be shipped with the Witch Queen and not with Lightfall. This is of course just a theory.
A game theory!
But putting the pieces together, it does make an awful lot of sense. When Beyond Light was first revealed, Bungie also talked about the future of Destiny, and showed us the Witch Queen and the Lightfall as working titles for the next years of DLC to come. And this is also where they mentioned that Lightfall would be where the whole Light versus Dark story would conclude.
It's going to continue with the next major expansion, the Witch Queen, and Lightfall is going to kind of drive this all to a moment.
Then, a year later, when The Witch Queen actually dropped, and already came out with a delayed release date, the plans for the future of Destiny were suddenly changed, and an extra year of DLC called The Final Shape would suddenly be where the story would actually conclude. This extra chapter called The Final Shape could be the result of them realizing that they wanted to do a little bit more after the story that they had originally planned out. But something that's more likely is that not everything that they wanted to include in the Witch Queen actually made the cut. And to not have to force everything into one final DLC, they made the decision into pushing the ending a year further away with a rename and changed Lightfall into the DLC that we got this year, with the core purpose to give us the things that didn't make it into Witch Queen, like Strand. A big tell, for example, is that the story of this year's Lightfall basically has no substance. and that the first and the last cutscene of the campaign can more or less be cut together, and everything in between has very little relevance on the bigger picture story-wise. Or you can just look at the deep side mechanic that the Witch Queen campaign was filled with, which was a rather odd mechanic that is now being theorized to be a replacement for where we would otherwise have used strength to get from point A to point B. There's a whole bunch of matching logos, some older statements made by Bungie. It's of course all still a theory, but it is one that certainly has some legs to stand on. If this is true, then that again means that the DLC that was originally going to be Lightfall is now being called the final shape. And the DLC that we got this year was more or less made in a single year to fill up the gap. This would explain why most of the new weapons that we can collect use weapon models of older guns in the game. It would explain why there's no new playlist armor, even though Bungie said that they would release a new set every year. And it would also explain why, even though Neo-Numa was supposed to be this city hidden from us for a very long time, has very similar looking buildings in the Braytech style, as if they were built by the same company as the buildings on every other planet.
It branched off from Earth during our collapse and shut off any communication. So they've been secretly existing on Neptune for a very long time and keeping themselves safe.
It would also explain why so many seasonal mechanics and environments from stuff like Season of the Splicer were reused during the main story of the campaign. And yes, it would also explain why Nimbus has such cringe dialogue, because if the final shape is going to be as dark and as serious as Bungie makes it seem, and if the current Lightfall that we got is something not originally planned, then the writers probably felt the need to make the current DLC overly goofy to avoid having 2 years in a row of straight up somberness pushed down our faces. It is a game about space magic, after all. Now, of course, there are other ways to explain most of these things. You could say that, hey, in the story, Clovis Bray made research facilities on Neo-Numa before the great collapse of Earth, so that's why the buildings look similar. But, you know, if Braytech had facilities on this planet, surely more people would have known about Neo-Numa. It can't just have been secretly hiding there with all of Strand for hundreds of years, right? Or what about the Vex stuff? Like, yeah, we have stuff from Season of the Splicer, but that's because it's the Vex. This is just how the Vex network looks like. Maybe those are reasonable explanations? I don't know. To me, as the average player, it just feels like a cop-out to just reuse as many already existing assets as possible, just like they did with the weapons. What we see here is a little bit of a butterfly effect, where due to the possible inability to get Strand shipped with the Witch Queen, a whole extra DLC had to be rushed out the door in a year's time just to make up for it. Which then, yes, of course, isn't going to be as good. All of this, it just comes down to a lack of time, and the result of multiple years of trying to keep up with the live service model that Destiny promises. Lightfall exists in its current form because live service games are hard, and even the industry's best cannot keep up with the amount of content that this type of game demands. And this isn't an issue that money can solve either, before we get to that part of the video, and trust me, we will. I mean, we all know just how much money Bungie is making with Destiny and has made in the past. But money cannot buy you talent, at least not always. Yeah, you can hire more developers to work on your game and to create more content, but those developers will still have to go through possibly years of training and working with the engine to become a competent part of the team. This is why Halo Infinite is such a mess. It's because Microsoft mostly hired short-term contract workers who, by the time they finally understood something about the engine, were already let go to be replaced by newer workers. And to find talented people who are not already working at other big studios, that is even more difficult. There's a real shortage of talented game developers in the industry right now. Bungie is currently hiring for tens of different job positions, even fully remote. But you cannot just hire anybody for the job, especially not for important senior level positions. You need people with a very specific skill set, and those can be extremely difficult to find, even if you throw money at them. So money does not buy you talent. And in the case with Bungie now, it also doesn't buy you time. Because you could argue that delaying the DLC might have been, again, the better move, just like they have in the past 2 years. But the thing that is different now is that Bungie is owned by PlayStation, who likely set a strict deadline for the DLC this year because they wanted to see some early financial returns on investment. $4 billion isn't nothing. And if the DLC were to be pushed back yet again, that would actually push it in the next fiscal year this time. So then of course you could make the argument that letting PlayStation buy out Bungie was perhaps a mistake, and not something that was necessarily the most pro-consumer move. And you might be right, but then I would remind you that the likely reason that they allowed themselves to be bought up like that is, again, because live service games are hard and they had been struggling to keep up for years now. The PlayStation deal came with deadlines, yes, but also a lot of extra resources. Now, I'm not here trying to defend all of Bungie, I'm just trying to make sense of the situation. And this is likely where we're at, and why we had Lightfall release in the way it did this year. Of course, I still think that it is an incredibly shitty anti-consumer move to release a half-baked DLC like Lightfall at a higher price than any other DLC before. Probably knowing full well it will sell anyway because of the hype, because of the success that Witch Queen was. I feel absolutely disrespected by the fact that this DLC is the most expensive one yet, while also being the worst one in a long time. And it is even more insulting to ask $20 to skip the campaign for a character boost, fully knowing that the story is the worst part of the DLC. It's very likely that these prices are set by PlayStation now, but even PlayStation must have known at some level that this DLC wasn't 100% ready yet. And they just decided that Bungie should take the PR hit because it would be worth the extra revenue. And they're probably right. But this is also a big reason why the DLC is received so negatively. Overly negative, I would say. Because the story is bad and the DLC has some issues, but looking past that, the rest of the game is still top tier. In fact, if I compare it to the Witch Queen, it is actually improved in a countless of ways. I don't even know where to begin listing them all. If I look back at my Witch Queen review that I did last year, you can see that I had a lot of complaints despite the campaign being top tier. For example, I felt that champions and seasonal mods were annoying to deal with and limited build diversity or creativity. I said that the gear modding system was extremely outdated, with over half of the mods being next to useless, and with the elemental affinity on armor making the inventory management a cluttery mess. I also mentioned that I hated the need to always use an app on my phone or on a second monitor on my PC just to make loadouts. I mentioned that the game was getting too easy due to the Void 3.0 ability spam. I mentioned the ammo economy was terrible and that if harder content like contest mode on raids was going to have these DPS checks, then we at least needed a consistent way of generating ammo.
You know how lucky we had to get to do this?
Yes. We are fucking...
You know how fucking lucky we had to... No!
And you know what the worst part is? You know what the worst part is? The fucking boss dropped heavy for me.
Yeah, same. Fucking...
There's a whole bunch more stuff. I'm not gonna list it all because the point here is 1 year later, well, we're here and every single one of those issues has either been fixed or made much less of an issue. Champions are now a core part of the gameplay sandbox with plenty of ways to kill them instead of just a singular gun mod. We have loadouts now within the game, not through the app, no, it's right there within the game. Mods got a rework and are pushed into this unified system, and almost every single one of these mods is useful now. There are set difficulties for a lot of activities, which means that mid-game builds become a lot more important. Loading into a different load zone when you're playing with someone else is a lot faster now. Even the red border weapon grind has been made a lot less frustrating. Is it all perfect? No, of course not. And we could definitely argue that some important mods are missing here and there, and some of the builds have been nerfed quite a bit too much. But it's a lot easier to look in the future and think that a few mods could be added back into the game, rather than having to work with an outdated and sloppy inventory and modding system. Oh, and did we talk about Strength? Because Strength, I think, is a massive success and is already implemented into the game a lot better than Stasis ever was. Remember how many Stasis weapons we had when Beyond Light launched? We had one, a singular one, an exotic grenade launcher, only good for glitching out of the map. It's still not used into any build to this day. Strength is here, right now, and it's part of the game. Strength builds are some of the best in the game right away. We have strength weapons, enemies with strength shields, strength specific perks, There's so much good stuff here this year, and it's a bit sad to see that the issues with the story are overshadowing everything else.
Well, the uglier they are, the harder they fall, right?
The whole conversation about Lightfall has turned into the fact that this DLC is rushed, and people are looking everywhere in every last corner to pick apart the game now. I'm seeing players say that Neo Numa is empty and lifeless. I mean, is it really? What about those special public events with 6 bosses that guarantees you an exotic? What about the Vex incursion stuff, which is miles above any planetary activity that we've gotten in the past? It's definitely better than a playlist activity that we got with the Witch Queen, because this time you're actually spending time on the planet, and you can actually meet up with random players that join and leave the event as they see fit. I compare Neo Numa to the barren wasteland of Europa or the moon, and Neo Numa actually feels quite alive. The add density is pretty good. The only problem that I have personally had with the content altogether is mostly just how repetitive in structure Destiny 2 has become. I'm sure that this is also yet another result of the developers always being short on time, but every year the delivery of the DLC has been the same. Go to the new planet, run through the story, level up the planetary vendor, go through the core playlist for pinnacle drops, do the exotic quest, and do the raid. It's not bad, but with the game missing that X factor this year, the burnout kicks in extra fast. At least for me. But that could also just be a more personal problem that I have with the game. I do look back at 0 Hour, and I remember how much I enjoyed that mission and how special it was. And now I'm running through Spire of Watchers, which is like a better version of 0 Hour. And even when I'm running through it blind, playing it for the first time, I'm running through it almost like I know where to go. Destiny and dungeons and jumping puzzles, they're second nature at this point. So in a way, that feeling of being lost and trying to figure out where to go, it's not really there anymore in Destiny for me. But if you were to ask a new player, his experience of Spire of Watchers would probably be just as good as my experience with 0 Hour. So I'm not even sure if this is a fair criticism. I think the way I look at it is that this year of Destiny, the story is pretty bad, and I think them charging more money for it than ever is a lot of bullshit. But other than that, Destiny is still really, really good. It just hasn't been able to recapture the magic for me and pull me back in like it has with previous years. I was hoping it would, but it just hasn't, because it all just feels a little bit too repetitive. But then again, live service games are hard, and reimagining their whole way of delivering a DLC or a campaign while also already being too low on time was never going to happen. Anyway, that is all for today. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.